briefly?
Sure, sure. So I'm currently bunkering down in Lake Tahoe. I arrived here from Mexico a few days ago, and just in time for a about 8 feet of snowfall. So I'm currently self-quarantined and snowed in for for the foreseeable future. Um, and yeah, thank you for the generous introduction, Paul. And I think I feel the same in the sense of feeling very fortunate right now in terms of being able to be flexible, having a safe place to kind of rest and to, I think similar to you, think about ways in which, we can sense make collectively and create spaces for kind of navigating through what is a huge amount of uncertainty and just trying to understand like what is the, not necessarily where it's going, but just what is the next step. How do we sit with what is coming up. Yeah, and I'm looking forward to this, looking forward to seeing where it goes, and hopefully there'll be some emergent conversations and threads.
So I want to share a short clip from Jonny's TED Talk, which is an amazing watch for people. I highly suggest it, but I'm going to share about a 90-second clip and then follow up with a question. So let's just hope this works. Share.
Alive and connected to the world. Leonard Cohen's lyrics ring in my mind. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. These moments of letting go were my medicine. It felt as if a protective armor was being stripped away, leaving me exposed to the world. And I sought to embrace a sense of radical curiosity for this inner landscape that was opening up. On land, I sat on 10-day silent Vipassana meditation retreats. In the sea, I took up the art of freediving, learning to soften into the loving squeeze of the ocean, falling 120 feet below the surface on a single breath. And these experiences have led to many conversations with friends and strangers on loss. A father taken by pancreatic cancer, a husband who took his own life, and a beloved dog who passed unexpectedly, and others wondering how they can support loved ones deep in grief. All I can share from my experience is that just being there is enough. Holding space without trying to fix anything is truly the most powerful support you can give.
I was on mute. So I just appreciate you sharing that story with people, but also the poetry of the soft squeeze of the ocean is just perfect. I'd love to hear like radical curiosity. I know that it is at the core of something that's really bringing you alive right now, but how are you thinking about radical curiosity and openness and holding space for people? I think people may be starting to go through the stages of grief with this disease, losing different things. But yeah, how are you thinking about some of these things as you go through this as well with everyone else?
Mm. I'm feeling kind of emotional watching that back in this context. It's really interesting. I think that for me, the evolution of my podcasts around curiosity has really evolved into this idea of courageous curiosity, which I define as the willingness to look at and inquire into that which is potentially painful or uncomfortable. And I think that it's important to premise this discussion with that in order to really lean into and to have this sense of radical curiosity, you must first feel safe and feel grounded and feel kind of in your body. I think there's certainly a risk of kind of leaning in or getting even sucked into some of these questions before you're feeling grounded in yourself, and that can just lead to traumatize yourself even further. So I think I'm almost viewing it as a kind of a two-part process. The first is finding ways to be still. There's a wonderful quote from Pema Chodron, and she talks about being a mountain in the midst of a hurricane, and it's like, how can you cultivate that calm stillness inside you that isn't contingent on all of the chaos that is unfolding on like a day-to-day basis. And I think that's kind of the first step, and I think that it feels to me like that's where a lot of people are at, because things are moving so quickly. And I think that once you find that place, maybe it's only for a few minutes per day, then the question is how do you first just notice the feelings in your body. Like if you're feeling a sense of fear or a sense of anxiousness, where is that showing in yourself? So for me, when I feel afraid, it's usually this like tightness in my gut. I kind of feel things contracting, sometimes around my sternum as well. It just feels really tense. And so just noticing that and acknowledging that and bringing some awareness into my body, I find really helpful. And if I have more space and maybe there's a friend with me as well, then there's the invitation to this radical curiosity, which is like, what is maybe this fear trying to tell me? Or is there a message underneath this fear? And just really kind of allowing yourself to sink into it. As I mentioned in the talk, learning to freedive is this process of falling down, and then with the pressure of the ocean, your body just gets more and more tense. And so every few meters, you have to kind of pause and check in, like, where am I tense? And then just relax into it. And then you can kind of fall a bit further. And I think the same is true with inquiring into and navigating some of these challenging emotions, whether that's frustration at the governments or fear, like financial fears, or maybe you're being uprooted, or maybe you're afraid about family and grandparents whose lives at risk. And I think it's also interesting for me to reflect the ways in which we respond to fear is often very illuminating. I think I've noticed on Twitter, some people go into this like type A proactive mode where they're just doing everything and they're trying to help, and it's great. But I think that is also a very effective distraction strategy from actually feeling what's going on. There's some people that kind of shut down emotionally and just pretend it's not there, and that's their strategy. And there's some people that go into like anger and blame mode, and you see that a lot on Twitter, people just like heckling abuse at whoever they can get in touch with. And I think it's just interesting to reflect on what is your kind of default response to the fear, and I think maybe more than anything, it's this deep sense of uncertainty and the inability to predict even a few days or weeks, let alone months or years ahead. And this idea that, many of us had these scheduled calendars. Like I had travel plans for the next 4 months, and they're just wiped clean. And it's like, when you just have to let go of what you thought was going to happen, and just learn to be present to what is. Those are some thoughts.
Yeah, so question from Scott. He said, when you don't have the ability to connect to your body, so disconnected from yourself, how do you begin? So what are some of the practices you've done in some, I know you've done a lot of breathwork coaching and a lot of meditation coaching. What are some of the practices, like even some of the simplest ones, that you might suggest?
Yeah, sure. Great question. And I think actually the first step is just like noticing. I think so often we can kind of get sucked into whether it's like a thread on Twitter or something happens, and it takes a few minutes or even a few hours sometimes to just notice that we've been like caught into this fear vortex or whatever that emotion is. And I think even just bringing awareness to that and having some psychological space between the emotion or the story and you witnessing it, and even just that I think is hugely helpful. And from there, if you don't feel that you're able to kind of, if your body's so charged and your nervous system is so kind of fired up, I find, I mean, it's different for everyone. I think for some people it's taking a short walk, for some people it's a cold shower, for some people it's maybe singing or humming or a conversation with a friend. I really find breathwork practices to be very helpful. And without going into too much detail, the very simple version is if your exhale is longer than your inhale, then it will downregulate your nervous system and activate the parasympathetic system, which essentially you can even, I've done it like wearing a heart rate monitor, and you can see your heart rate just going down in real time. And so for me, I might do like an inhale for 4, then hold that for 4, and then exhale for 8. And just even doing that 4 or 5 times, it not only helps to regulate your nervous system, but it brings your attention and your awareness to your breath, and you can focus on that as opposed to focusing on wherever your mind's spinning, wherever it's kind of taking you. And even just 60 seconds of that, I think can make a big difference. But I think it's really interesting to consider and be intentional about the practices that you design. I think of this as like it's like an emotional regulation toolkit, but whatever things you can do, whether they take 60 seconds or maybe it's a hot bath at the end of the day, just however you can down regulate your nervous system and get out of this kind of perpetual fight or flight feeling that I think a lot of us have, particularly if we have access to Twitter or social media or the news or anything like that. And just having some disconnected time during the day when we can really just relax, and knowing that that's really important for our body to recover and to rest well, and then to face the next day. So I think having your own kind of toolkit of practices to help you get into the body and to help you to really just downshift your nervous system. It's really that simple. And also having someone to talk to, having a friend who can just hold space for you, I think is also very good. Great question.
Do you have a response from that?
Something came up for me specifically around this idea of when people themselves are very resistant to the idea of getting out of their kind of agitated state, because it's so habituated, it's what they know, and the idea of doing something to take themselves out of it is hard. And something the Math Potts said at the meaning conference in his really fantastic talk, which he said, sitting with people. Sorry, my microphone keeps screwing around. Thanks. He said sitting with people who are on the brink of taking their own life a number of times, he found one of the most helpful things he did was he asked them for a favor. He asked if they could help him. And it made me think about the time that we're in at the moment. And I think everyone's attention, their anxiety is being ratcheted up. I think the situation is kind of bringing to the surface a lot of fears or anxieties that may have been sort of bubbling away beneath, and it's bringing them up. And I think a good antidote to that is going from that place of where your vision becomes much more narrow, and you think, what can I do to protect myself, to sort myself, panic buy toilet paper, I'm going to do this for myself, I'm going to hunker down with my family, and turning the gaze a bit wider to ask, how can I serve? And that question as well can, I think, in a way, almost like quite quickly flip, as Math Potts talked about, giving somebody responsibility and agency very quickly by asking for help is a really interesting way to get them out of their fight or flight response. So like, oh, now I need to be in support. I think it's not always going to work, right? Because some people don't have that capacity, but I was curious about that. So yeah, that's what came up for me. But
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And what that brings up is both the sense of I think it's important that we, to use the kind of airplane metaphor of putting on our own oxygen masks first
Yeah.
before necessarily supporting others. And but at the same time, I think just having that awareness that we're not going through this alone and that there's other people struggling. And like you say, kind of expanding our awareness to beyond like our narrow self kind of worry and judgment. Um, hmm.
Yeah. So Ben Ford asked, have you read The Trauma of Everyday Life? And if you haven't, maybe Ben could share with us.
No, I haven't. I'd love to hear a brief synopsis or what you got from that.
Okay, sure. So I read this whoa, 4 or 5 years ago, I suppose. So Mark Epstein is a therapist and also a Buddhist, very deep into meditation. And that book plus one more called Mindsight by Dan Siegel. So both of these guys are, they use mindfulness as a mechanism for changing sort of the neurological structure of the brain, essentially. And Mark Epstein, he talks a lot about the lots of various different types of meditation, but the message through the book was just acceptance that trauma is coming to everyone. You can't control it. There's always something that's going to bite you. And I think it's when we enter into these kind of very very complex non-linear times that you can be rolling along, everything looks great, all going well in when you're in a linear environment, but as soon as you get a little bit of complexity and a little bit of non-linearity, you very soon figure out whether that's true or not. And I've been meaning to reread it for a little while, but I think I might bump it out the list.
Thank you. There's two things that come to mind there. The one is a piece around meditation, which I'd love to go into a deeper discussion with if that's relevant for people. But I almost view it as like strengthening different emotional muscles. And I think right now it's a really good time to like start going to that meditation gym. And whether you want to practice compassion and empathy for fellow humans who are struggling, or maybe it's just cultivating that kind of non-judgmental witness perspective where you're able to view what is going on in the external world and also what is arising in yourself without distancing yourself from it, but also without sucked into it, and just having that kind of space to see what's coming. And again, that is a muscle, and you're training your amygdala to fire less and be in that perpetual state of fight or flight. And on the piece around trauma, again, it's a much deeper kind of nuanced conversation. But I've just come out from a breathwork training, and one of the interesting videos that we saw during this was when an impala was chased by a lion, and it narrowly survived and just about got away with its life. And it goes behind a bush, and it will just shake for like 10-15 minutes, and that shaking process is its way of releasing the trauma from its body. And like humans are designed to do that too, but we're just not taught or kind of shown or given permission to do that. So I think where we get into trouble is where these kind of micro stresses or micro traumas accumulate during the course of a day or a week or a month, and we don't have a way of shaking and kind of releasing that energy from our body. And so we get trapped in this state of our adrenals stay firing as if we're still in that stressed state, as if we're being chased by that lion. And so having these outlets every day to kind of regulate that trauma from our body is so important. That's kind of what comes, and I think that for me makes a difference between there's a phrase in psychology known as post-traumatic growth. And I think the question that I'm kind of sitting with is how can we both personally and collectively emerge from what is going on with post-traumatic growth and having become stronger out the other side, as opposed to post-traumatic stress, and just being collectively traumatized from everything that's going on.
Fantastic. Appreciate all the sharing here.
Can I?
So, yeah, go ahead.
This is Luke in Philly.
Hey, Luke.
Good to see you again, Paul, and everyone who we may have crossed paths before. And yeah, Angie, good to see you again. One thing that I also wanted to say about like definitions of trauma, at least like in the Western definition of trauma, that has a lot to do with feelings of powerlessness and feelings of inability to change a situation, and have it like in the world of post-traumatic growth. And I can the people who do that research do it out of North Carolina, Charlotte, and I can find their resource page real quick and send it into the comments. One thing about post-traumatic growth is like being able to recenter power internally. And that's something for, I think, everyone. And just a little bit of context, this is a world that I'm also in predominantly with high school age students. And so thanks, Paul. Did you find it already? You definitely did. And so just in thinking about like trauma, powerlessness, growth, and how we frame our narratives, as well as how our bodies respond, and kind of living in that space where when we feel fear, we can quickly like create a narrative of ceding control and ceding power to this whole thing is wild, and like I have no power to do anything. And that those can cascade those fight and flight responses. And one thing, I've been doing this a lot myself, especially, I'm an extrovert, but part of that, as I've learned, is my own defense mechanism, because sometimes when I'm by myself, I can get into these loops and definitely into the disembodied space of, well, now my fear is about myself, and the actual external thing is like, it's not that it's irrelevant, but now I have a whole like ocean to go through to even get to what initially was the thing that I was concerned about. And so kind of watching for when any of us feel the narrative of like our own control. And there's an idea in the psychology world of agency and locus of control. And so the idea of locus of control is, do you place your control with yourself or outside of yourself? And something that I've been doing, I've been like experimenting on, and actually been thinking about like, this would be an interesting daily practice to put out into the world, is in a moment where there is so much that is out of our control, what are even the small things that we can control in terms of external environment, of like, cool, I haven't left my house in a couple days. That feels like really destabilizing. However, I can control seeing that Paul put this up on Twitter and being like, I'm definitely going to participate. Like, cool, that's something I can control. As well as like internally in that locus of control, it kind of is that like internal external mirror. And so sometimes when the external is, oh, I really can't control, like, have I been exposed to this thing? Okay, I'm currently asymptomatic, but I also ride public transportation. And then internally, that feeling of like, oh, I don't have control over my fear, I don't have control over my response, and that's a space where you can, like what you were saying to the radical and courageous curiosity, right? Explore the like, what leads me to feel like I can't control my fear? Because that almost gives you the opportunity to look at what other things, what other cues of a fear response might be triggering that I usually have the narrative of I can't control, but I have all the time in the world right now. So I can let myself be afraid, go through one of these breathing practices, 15 minutes from now, come back to this, ooh, this still feels too overwhelming to think about. Okay, let's go through this breathing practice again. Okay, and then at some point, see where you can get the into like, okay, I feel like I can really explore and be curious as to what else beyond the fear of the current situation might I be feeling, in a way that then can let you feel regained control, even in the new state of like, I live in my house right now. I've left my house, not in the last 48 hours. I am a freelance employee, so like I've been having negotiations. I predominantly work in schools. So as all the schools are shut down, starting conversations of what does it look like to reorient my contract so that my income now may be gone. Yeah, this is something that, like, just to tie this up, for me, it's like, okay, all of that is out of my control right now. That's scary. What is in my control is to try and negotiate this at the pace that it's moving, which I also don't have control over, but I can control preparing myself and getting ready for these conversations to the best of my ability. So that's, that's an extended offering.
Fantastic. So